Welcome to this video tutorial on how to create a sunrise animation using VRay within Grasshopper. In this tutorial I'm going to use this simple model here to create a sunrise animation utilizing VRay's render engine directly within Grasshopper to be able to control the position of the sun at certain times of day. To do this, we're going to first start by opening up Grasshopper, just by typing in Grasshopper into our Rhino command line, like so. With this open, we're going to make a new document just by going File, New, and we're going to go over to the VRay tab to open up the VRay render settings. Now to begin, we're going to start by creating a VRay render node. That's found under the Render tab here, under the little VRay icon, and we're just going to click and drag that out into our slate editor. To work with this, we're going to begin by right-clicking on that node and hitting the Show Controls option. This will open up our render controls, and we're going to keep the engine as a CPU, the sampler as progressive, and the quality as medium for now. Under the image output, we're going to select a place we want our image to save just by double-clicking on there, selecting a folder, and giving our file a name, and I'm just going to call it number 1 now. This will mean that when we render out our animation, it will automatically save to this folder for us. Once we've set up those initial kind of render settings, we then need to add our geometry into our scene under this VRay Geometry tab. We can do this by going to the Geometry tabs here and creating a VRay Geometry node, which we're going to click and drag onto our scene. And we're going to connect that up into the VRay Geometry slot there. Now in order to select this geometry in my Rhino file and input it into my render scene, we need to create a parameter to hold this information. We're going to go to the parameters slot in Grasshopper. We're going to select the BREP parameter here, which can collect polysurfaces and 3D model information. We're then going to select all of our model like so, right click on that BREP option and click on the Set Multiple BREPs there. You'll see once that's done, once we select that, it will go green to show us that it's selecting all that geometry, and we can then just plug it into the geometry node there. Now what this will do is it will mean that the render in VRay in Grasshopper will be able to detect our model, and we can test that just by right clicking on this render and hitting Render Interactive. That will load up our VRay frame buffer, and if we pan around the model we can see now that we have our model in there. Now before we set up our lighting in the scene, I'm first going to set up a camera angle which we're going to render out our view with. To do that, we're just going to stop our render for the time being. We're going to hit on the VRay tab here, and we're going to go back to the VRay camera option. We're just going to click and drag that out into our scene. Now I'm going to move these nodes over to give us a little bit more space, like so, and we're going to input our camera into that camera option there. You see, once you've made this camera node, if we just minimize this slightly and pan out, you'll see we'll then have a green camera in the scene because I'm selecting that node there, and this little camera icon represents the camera in my scene. Now if you want to set that from a particular view, for example if we want to zoom in perhaps on this part here, and maybe I want a camera that's kind of looking at the scene in perspective sort of across these hills here, perhaps something like this, we can set it up in our viewport. Then if we go back to our Grasshopper file, right click on the camera and click Get from Active Rhino Viewport, it will essentially move the camera to this view that we've set in our scene. We can then test that by rendering it out, and there we can see that view. Now we might want to tweak it slightly. I'm just going to move mine up and also zoom it out a little bit like so, and once you tweak it you can always go back, and we're just going to minimize this so we can see it a bit more clearly like so. Go back to a camera and we can click Get from Active Viewport again just to reset that. And there you can see we've got a nice view of our scene there in a kind of landscape aspect ratio. So we can see the kind of scene, and we can also see a bit of the landscape as well. For the purpose of this tutorial, I'm just going to kind of minimize this in slightly, and I'm going to dock it just here so we can see it next to our Grasshopper kind of controls there. So now we've set up our camera, we've got our VRay geometry set up as well. Now we can look at the lighting setup, and this is where we're going to start to create our sunrise animation using a VRay Sun and also setting up a lighting environment for the scene. Now to do this, I'm going to keep the render running so we can see any changes as we make them. I'm going to move my node down here, and we're going to go up to the lighting tab here, and we're just going to open it up and select the VRay Sun to start, and then we're just going to click and drag this out onto the scene. with that VRay Sun, I'm going to connect it into the light option there, and as you can see, my lighting is now updated and we've got a strong sunlight in. Now the position of this sunlight is set by this position marker, and it has a default value to begin with, but it may be that you actually want to control that more specifically, especially if we're trying to create an animation that has the sun rising and sun setting at certain times or certain specific angles. So in order to do that, we can actually input a vector into this position tab to control those numbers. As you can see here, the numbers are 0.5, 0.5 and 0.707, but we can be more specific with exactly what we want those to be. So I'm going to go to the vector tab. We're going to collect this construct point vector, and we're just going to drag it out onto our scene, and we're just going to input that directly into the position. Now, once you've done that, it will reset that position value now to 0, 0, 0, because none of these have an input at the moment. So it's just defaulting it to that 0 mark. What you'll see here is we're not getting any of those long shadows anymore because the sun's directly above our model. So that's why it's kind of looking like it is here. Now, if we want to control these values, we can actually add an input into them to start to control them. And I prefer to add a slider in there, which allows us to kind of vary the degree that we want those values controlled using this parameter here. Now, I'm going to right click and just edit these values. And we're just going to set them to a whole number just by clicking on this N with a maximum of 100, like so, and a minimum of 0. And once you've done that, I'm going to select that. I'm going to hit Control C on my keyboard to copy it, and then Control V to paste it. I'm going to do that twice. So we end up with 3 sliders, like so. We can then plug those in to the X, the Y, and the Z, as you can see here. And what that will mean now is I can start to move these around to vary that position. Now, if I move them left and right, and if we kind of minimize this so we can see what's happening in our Rhino file, we've now got, and it's this sort of big circle here, our sun going kind of directly horizontal. We can't see it because it's slightly in that geometry. If I make it ghosted or kind of a wireframe, for example, we can see it there, and it's kind of hiding in the middle of the geometry here. And if I select it, it's that little green icon. Now, if we open up our render frame buffer again, just so we can see it, and now this time I'm going to select the Z coordinate, you can see now the lighting start to change. And what's happening here is I'm effectively moving the kind of sun from a 0 position up higher in the sky. Again, if I minimize it, we can see it here as we move that sun up and down in our model. So that Z coordinate is essentially kind of varying the height and angle of our sun to go from a sun kind of rise right at this horizontal angle all the way to a sort of midday sun once it's much higher in the sky. So we can use that Z coordinate to essentially sort of change the angle of the sun at different times of day. And this is what we're going to use to create our sunrise and sunset animation. Now, the X and Y coordinates don't matter too much. You can see they're just sort of changing the direction slightly in that slight angle of the sun. Usually what I'll do is I'll keep these at a consistent number, and then I'll just be changing that Z value there, like so. And again, if we open up our kind of frame buffer so we can see what's happening here, as I change it upwards, you'll notice then the sun gets brighter in the sky up to 100 all the way down to a kind of sunrise down here. So that's the kind of basic sunlight control, and that's controlling the sort of main light source that's lighting up our scene. We can also add an environment map, which will give us a little bit of background light to the scene and also kind of match it up with the sun, so the environment will be kind of yellower and more dusky in the morning, and then as it rises it will get brighter and bluer like a midday sun should be. Now, this is controlled in this environment tab here, and we can find the environment controls if we go back to VRay under this environment option here. So I'm just going to click and drag this out into my scene. Now, at the moment, we've got this kind of background, this GI, which is global illumination, reflection and refraction options here. They currently don't have anything plugged in. So if I plug this into our environment, you're just going to get this black environment in the background here because nothing is being plugged into those. But we can also go into this texture slot, and here we can find a VRay sky. And this can actually control our environment and link it directly with our sun. So what I'm going to do is going to take that sky, we're going to link it to the background, and we're going to take our sunlight and we're going to connect it into the sky as well. And what this would do is when we control our Z coordinate, you'll see as we go higher, it gets a lighter blue. As we go lower, it gets more dusky. And so that starts to control a little bit more the kind of background of our scene based upon the site, height and positioning of our sun. Now what I usually do is actually connect this into the global illumination as well, and the reflection and the refraction as well. So we're going to use it to connect all of these up. The reason being is that it will actually sort of vary the atmosphere of our scene. It will get darker as the sun is lower, it will get brighter as the sun is higher. So you can see now that we're getting a complete sort of color shift in the lighting of the model based upon the time of day of the sun. And this is going to be a kind of key aspect in controlling our animation and creating this sort of atmospheric sunrise and sunset based upon the positioning of that sun. So now we've got our sun set up, we've got those controls, and we've got kind of nice environment going on, and we've got a nice lighting. What we're going to do now is add in an animation timeline into this scene to start to control this over a period of time. To do this, we can go into that render tab in VRay again, and we're going to select the timeline option, and we're just going to click and drag it out here. I'm just going to move this geometry slightly under there, so it's slightly out of the way for now. Now this way the timeline works is we have a start and an end position, which we can vary here, and the number of frames in our timeline is set by this little frames marker. Now by default it's set to 30, which means we'll go from frame 0 all the way to frame 29. But if we want to up that number, we can input a new number into here. I'm going to take a slider from up here again, I'm just going to copy and paste it, plug it into the frames, and I'm going to up that number to 100. And therefore we've got frame 0 to 99 now to deal with, so with slightly longer animation. Now whenever you're doing animations, the more frames you have, the smoother that animation will be, so bear that in mind when you're kind of setting up any animation settings with exactly kind of how you might want to vary it over time and what you want the animation to look like. So at the moment we've got 100 of these frames that we can connect now into our kind of sunlight position to start to control that position over the time of our animation. At the moment that position is basically controlled by this Z coordinate that we can use to kind of lower or kind of rise or set the sun in the sky, but I can link it now to this sort of frame or fraction output of my timeline to control this value with the timeline instead of with this slider. Now an easy way to do this is just to take that output frame, which is basically going from 0 when it's here all the way to 99 when we're on frame 99, and it essentially kind of outputs whatever the number of frame we're on, and we can take that and plug that straight into that Z value. What this will mean is if I'm on frame 0, the sun will be set because that will be a 0 value in the height, and as we move up the sun will rise as we move through our animation. So you can see we're directly controlling the sun height based upon the number of frames in our animation, like so. Now it might be that actually it's moving too quickly, and you find as we move through animation the sun actually gets to quite a high height by frame 30, and from that point on it doesn't really change. Maybe you want it to be a bit slower in our animation. We can use the maths kind of parameters here to actually slow things down. So if I took a kind of maths parameter, we're going to take a division here, we're going to put this in, and instead of taking that frame and plugging it straight into that Z value, I'm going to first plug it into the A slot of this division, then we're going to take our slider we've got left over here, I'm going to put this on a value of 2 for example, plug it into B, and then plug it into the Z. And essentially what this is doing is on frame 0 it will be 0, but on frame 8 for example it will take that number 8, it will divide it by 2, and then it will put the result out as 4 and then plug that into the Z value. So instead of going up by 1, for every 1 frame it increases, it's going up by 0.5 in this value. So if we move to frame 9, it will be a 4.5 value here. So it's effectively kind of slowed down the animation of the sunrise by half. And then you could vary that again, we could do it by a third, so then it's much slower in the sky. So you can use these divisions to essentially slow down the rate of change in your model, and if I wanted a really slow sunrise I could divide it by kind of 4 or 5 in here. If I wanted quite a quick one we could leave it as 1. So you can essentially start to change these numbers using that kind of maths parameter before we input it into the height of our sun. For now I'm going to keep it on 3 because I think that's quite a nice sort of slow rise here in my animation. And as a final thing, we're then going to render out this animation as a series of JPEGs using our kind of render tab here. So once you're happy with your setup, you've got your timeline set, we then need to plug that timeline into our VRay render node to make sure it's connected. And once we've done that, we can right click on that render node and click this render animation to start rendering out each of the frames of our animation. This will be saved wherever we've kind of located it in our image output. So to do that, we're going to right click, hit render animation, and here you'll see it will start rendering out each frame. What it would do at the bottom of this little node here, if we sort of zoom in on it, is it will actually start counting the frames up. So you can see here it's rendering frame 1 of 100. Once it completes the first frame, it will then move on to frame 2, and it will slowly move through each of those frames until it's rendered all of them. The speed of this is essentially based on this quality setting here, so the lower the quality, the faster it will be. This will also be determined by the output resolution, so the higher the resolution you have, the longer it will take. So always bear the resolution and the quality in mind when determining how fast your render might take to complete the full animation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video and we're going to then look at the final animation that has been exported. This animation has now been completed, and we can then look in our folder, and here you can see all of those frames that have been exported for my sunrise animation. From here you can use softwares like After Effects or Resolve to pull these frames together into a video file, which you can then import into other software to create feature-length films or longer animations using some of these render settings. So that was just a quick video tutorial on how you can start to make a sunrise animation using VRay integrated within Grasshopper. You can see this timeline function is a very powerful tool within this program, and we can use it to create a variety of animation settings using VRay's pre-built-in render setup and the kind of accuracy you can get from that render engine. I hope you found this video tutorial useful, and if you want to watch any other videos on animating and rendering in VRay for Rhino, please do check out the videos on the channel. Thanks for watching.